Okay, so this is a very fun video. This is one which I have been looking forward to recording for a while. It is a two historians with the wonderful Professor Harry Bennet. And I'm just going to pass you straight into it, and I'll do my normal thing at the end where I talk about other projects that got coming up and things that are sort of coming along. But this was a very, very fun experience for me. This was one of my examiners from my PhD, getting to chat with him, and also it was getting a chance to spend some time talking to a historian who is absolutely wonderful. He has such a range of knowledge, such a range of understanding, and has been involved in so many projects which really do underpin quite a lot of the modern history and modern study of history, but also making the study of history easier. He was a big factor in this sort of series, the series of the Britannia Britannia Naval Histories of World War II, and publishing by University of Plymouth Press. This series and all the documents which come out with them, and dispatches documents, and so many different things have come out from his work that today make the life of a historian researching so much more accessible. And that's the big thing. Harry's always been very big about making it accessible. And today's topic is naval culture, and whether it exists, and if it does exist, what its form and why does it matter, and if it does matter even. And that can sound like a very academic discussion, but I think you will find it's very much not an academic discussion. It's very much a very interesting and a very fun discussion. So thank you very much, and hope you enjoy.
Forces, but apparently I'm responsible if they learn bad words. It's
Uh,
me.
well, I was the devil, which is YouTube. I mean, clearly that's what it is.
Yeah. Um. So hello and welcome everyone. This is the wonderful Harry Bennett, who was one of my PhD examiners, who is an absolutely amazing historian whose books are spectacular, and I've recommended on this channel many times. And today we're going to be talking about naval culture and whether it matters. Now, I have to say, Harry's spectacular, but I'm going to let him introduce himself a bit as well, because you all should know more about Harry. They should.
Well, personally, I think of myself as a complete nobody, the average person in the street with an interest in matters maritime. So thank you for that really rather remarkable send up. I kind of don't recognise myself in that wonderfulness, and my nearest and dearest would all equally, I think, be thinking, wonderful. I'm not so sure about that.
Well, I just remember that Prof. Lambert was very excited when he got you as one of my examiners. He was very, very excited for my PhD because he thought that, in his words, you and I would definitely have fun chatting. That was his,
Well,
yeah,
certainly the case during the PhD, and hopefully the case today. So
yeah,
I am known
yeah.
to too much.
It's fun. It's fun. So, naval culture. Well, the first question is we have to work out what it is. Because it's always this kind of. Some people jump on it and go, this is naval culture. Then you go, is it? Is it not? And also, in fact, naval culture has bled. What was potentially naval culture has bled so much into national culture, especially in the UK, that's often indistinguishable.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, I thought, we could look at, for example, at a sort of rather narrow topic, such as, close air defense on ships. But I thought this one would be a really difficult one to actually do because it is literally completely nebulous.
Mm-hmm.
It's very, very hard to actually nail down. It's literally like wrestling with water. And the other thing about it is it may be a lot more important than some of your viewers actually think. Certainly, as I've looked into it, the significance of it has just grown and grown in terms of what I see as the way in which navies actually respond to it and actually think about it and try to address it. So I think it's a really interesting topic that we kind of underestimate potentially at our peril in the UK and perhaps abroad, and perhaps there are other jurisdictions. I'm thinking particularly the United States Navy, where I think they're far ahead of, for example, the United Kingdom in actually thinking about this issue of culture as a key feature in the success, hopefully the success of organisations, particularly navies. So it's a thorny issue, and I think you're absolutely right in terms of the way in which we all have a national culture, and it's clearly part of that. You know, do nations, communities actually think of themselves as maritime, currently or historically, and having sort of features of national life which are close to the sea? Now, we could say that, you know, the United Kingdom historically is a nation which is much mired in a kind of national maritime culture historically, both by dint of nation, things that have happened in the past, forms that the nation state has actually taken, expressions of that nation state in terms of navies, interest in the sea, including the merchant navy and national trade. But of course, one of the kind of key issues that we deal with today is whether or not countries like Britain are really sort of a part of a national maritime culture in terms of the present. And we talk, for example, in terms of things like sea blindness. Is actual sea blindness part of a kind of a decline of what might be described as a national culture in which the maritime is to the fore? So many things may be actually sort of caught up.
I think one of the things you have to that sort of gets into it is, of course, Britain's a nation which likes to emphasize tradition over culture, whereas tradition is often a part of culture, in my view. And the amount of times I will get Cunningham's paraphrasing of an earlier quote quoted at me, because he goes, "It'll take, you know, we have to go to them because that's what we have to. The Navy has to retreat down because it takes 3 years to build a ship, but it takes 300 years to build a tradition, and we've always done it." And what I love is the part of the quote which is skipped out from the past which is a old quote which sometimes attributed to Pepys, but it's probably not Pepys. Is it takes 30 years to build a crew. Sort of 3 years to build a ship, 3 years to build a ship, 30 years to build a crew, and 300 to build a tradition. And that's a really rather interesting point to put in it, because the point is that when you look at it, the crew know what to do themselves because of the 300 years of tradition. And so they'll make use of the 3 years to build the ship to actually use that ship. And it's almost saying, look, the constructing of the ship, that's actually the easy bit, almost. Because it's 30 years to build that crew, but it's 300 years shaping that crew thanks to tradition. And that's culture.
Yeah.
But you've got to preserve that, because it's kind of like institutional memory. Once it's gone, I can't think of a way you can rebuild it. Not easily.
Yeah, I mean, it literally takes forever. And of course, what you just touched on is one of the other problems with this idea of a maritime culture, because there are so many words which are almost interchangeable and a part of it. So tradition, heritage, history, in that kind of institutional learning, that institutional identity. This is where maritime culture, naval culture, is so amorphous. But you've also begun to touch upon the idea as well of those kind of different cultures. You know, the idea of a national maritime culture, naval culture that takes 300 years to build, the idea of a ship and shipbuilding, which maybe takes 3 years to actually produce a ship, and the idea of a crew, which is going to mature over a considerable period of time. So we're dealing with the national level, we're dealing with stuff which is within navies, and we're also dealing with stuff which is on ship and also at the level of ordinary seamen. And I think that's really quite interesting in terms of the way, you know, just as you begin to posit it there, you begin to actually break it down in all sorts of interesting levels.
And it's always been fun for me, because I do a lot of work, as you know, on ship design and ship organization. And the amount of times I find historians saying, especially if they come from a different culture, let's say they come from America, where they tend to write down very specifically in the ship designs exactly what's going to be put into place. But the British tend to put, this will be this rope block will need to accommodate the standard amount of ropes.
Yeah.
And the amount of American historians who I've spoken to over the years who've complained, what is the standard amount of ropes? And I go, well, basically it was standardized in about 1900. Did they ever write it down? No, they didn't need to write it down. Everyone knew what was the standard amount of ropes that the ship was needed to carry. It needed to carry
Yeah.
so many ropes per length of ship. And they just look
Yeah.
at me going, but surely you need to write this down in your order form. I went, no, the Navy didn't need to write it down. The constructors knew what it was. The naval officers knew what it was. The shipyards knew exactly what it was. No one needed to write it down. Everyone knew.
Except when you get to a period when your navy is in decline, and those things which are enshrined in institutional memory begin to disappear out of the back door as senior ranks begin to move on to retirement and other fields. Then it becomes a major problem in terms of actually not writing it down. The American way, certain advantages.
Yeah, there is, and but my dad would on the rope one. The reason it sticks in my memory is because my dad, I think I told you this, was a naval architect. He worked on the Type 23s, and one of the jokes that came up because he was one of the team who noticed that the flight deck wasn't exactly designed. It had another strength points the right way round for a Merlin rather than a Sea King because their airframe, their landing gear is different. It's orientated the other way around, so the strength points hadn't been positioned properly. And so you noticed that change of it. And one of the jokes is he said, because he's a bit of a historian, was, "Oh, don't worry, now we've got space for a standard rope locker." And everyone looked at him and went, "What?" And he went, then he checked the rest of the design and went, "You didn't have space for the standard amount of rope on the ship. We needed to." And so since the Type 23s, that was explained, and now from the Type 45s onwards, why do Type 45s have actually got decent space for rope locker for rope? It's because the Type 23 was the first class which hadn't, because by the time they designed them, all that memory had been lost.
Yeah. So I mean, I think really what you're talking about there is the idea of culture at the level of the Navy. What I mean by that is almost the upper deck, the way in which navies actually think of themselves and communicate their ideas within themselves, and actually preserve or lose that institutional memory as a result of the way certain things actually go. So naval culture. Now, how do navies perceive of themselves and their role within the national life? How do they begin to think of themselves in playing a role not just in maritime strategy, but in national strategy, grand strategy, the economic strategy of navies? And how by their heritage and history do the Navy play a role in national affairs? Things like naval reviews, practices, down to the level of designing particular ships. The key role of things like historic vessels. Obviously, Great Britain, we have HMS Victory, we have HMS Belfast. The United States has an entire fleet of historic vessels, and other nations do too. And how also in that conception at the upper level, how do navies actually think of the way in which the officer class, if we can call them that, relates to the lower deck, those kind of lower deck issues? So I think this is almost our sort of second level of what naval culture might actually be, from the national down to the level of the Navy.
There's also the problem in how does the Navy express itself, because one of the problems I think the modern Royal Navy has dealt with is that whilst post World War One it did have issues, and there were people who got used to being politically active. In terms of, you got Admiral Henderson, you got a few others who are very good at making the Navy's case for funding in the face of the other threats. A large part of the Navy hadn't realized that post World War One the world had changed, that they weren't just going to get funding with just opening their mouth, that they needed to make the case themselves and needed to make the case continuously. And it took them, I think, honestly, I would argue it took them to the Falklands War before they really got shocked into realizing that was going to be the case. And it took them almost some 40s, because they looked at what they went to the war with in the Falklands War, and they didn't have enough ships, and their ships weren't really up to what they needed to, but they managed to pull it through against a near-peer threat. And they did it quite well. Although I do love Michael Clapp's joke, I'm not sure if you've heard it, which was he when he was deciding where to where to put the amphibious task group, where to go into whether it was San Carlos Bay or whatever. He remembered his old training as a buccaneer observer and his time in squadrons, and went, rock beats missile. If I want to defend, the best defense I can have against Exocet is to be surrounded by rock. So we're going in there. And if you think about San Carlos Bay, that is literally what helped them. You couldn't get a missile lock on the fleet in there, the force in there, because no missile was getting through the rocks.
Yeah,
at that time,
can't argue with the rock.
No, but you sit there and go, the Navy really suffered because it just didn't understand why it needed to explain itself, because it expected itself to be understood automatically.
Yeah. And I think that's interesting. That's almost a kind of failure of culture, because in a sense, you pick a really interesting date there, the sort of end of the First World War. And I think probably up until that point, since Trafalgar, since the French wars, then the Navy feels it's so much a part of that national culture. It's so part of that national identity, where you get the royal family identifying with the Navy very, very closely. The Navy almost felt of itself as untouchable. But of course, the First World War, there's Jutland, but there's no rerun of Trafalgar. There isn't the enormous, great battle of devastation that the British public expects. In fact, the Grand Fleet, while a generation is fighting and dying in the mud of France and Flanders, the Grand Fleet is swinging at anchor gently in Scapa Flow and quietly rusting in the way in which members of the public who are losing their loved ones in the trenches may perceive it. And it's at that point, I think, that you get a kind of real divorce, potentially, in terms of that naval message, which needs to be reiterated. The Navy has taken its eye off the ball in a way in which, for example, a young service like the Royal Air Force, it just come into existence. We know we've got to get the message out there. The Navy's taking it for granted.
I think also you have to remember the Royal Navy it's almost so horrified internally, it doesn't realize how horrified people were externally. It didn't get Jutland. It didn't Jutland. You know, you think about the Royal Navy, come World War II, it's the only Navy where all its pilots can fly at night and strike at night of all the three major navies. It's obsessed with night fighting. Its crews are the only ones which are all fitted with ASDIC because of Abaca, Cressy, and Hogue. They are all fitted with ASDIC or hydrophones of some kind, so they can hear a submarine coming and torpedoes coming and can get out the frigating way. It's been spent 20. I often say World War II is about exercising the Royal Navy's demons from World War I. And it does that pretty darn well. But the trouble is it's been so focused on fighting those demons internally and dealing with that thread internally of not understanding why it didn't win, why the Germans got away at night, why the Germans didn't fight better at night. Because that's what they'd have thought. They didn't think they would withdraw. Why would you use the opportunity to withdraw from the enemy? If you can get away at night, you go in and kill the enemy. You don't withdraw. You don't run away. But they got away. And the Royal Navy spent quite a lot of the interwar period looking very much internally, trying to fix these issues. And I think it makes them a very poor communicator in many ways because they are talking internally. And that's why people like... I'm going to keep. I know I sing his praises rather a lot, but the guy does massive amount of stuff that people often seem to forget him. But they're not able to forget him on my channel because I talk about him a lot. Admiral Henderson is so important because he's basically the one who goes, "Okay, look, yeah, we need to tell people exactly what we're doing." But the trouble is, he's not even very good at it because he doesn't do big public speeches. He doesn't want to do that. He's not. He does the quiet talks one-on-one, which Britain in that period is sort of still able to do. What I would call the top-down management of procurement and all these things. But as we've gone on, and as public attention has got more and more important, that's become less and less of a viable strategy.
Yeah. And what's interesting is I think you can actually see that threat begin to emerge in what might be described as the national culture. So, you look at the three big paintings that are commissioned at the end of the First World War, which deal with the politicians, which deal with the generals of the First World War and the admirals of the First World War by Stockdale Cope. You look at that enormous painting where you see the key admirals of the First World War. It's marked by division. The painting is marked by a sense of this is a service which is kind of like it's lost its rudder. it doesn't quite know where it's actually going, that there are different elements of this team which are not communicating with each other, not necessarily communicating with the public, and riven by difference. So it's interesting that the kind of failure of what might be described as that institutional culture is reflected in the way in which it's being portrayed at the national level. So yeah, it's very interesting.
And it's something which sort of carries on when you think about it, because the trouble for the Navy is they got so used to not having to fight for attention that when it came to fighting for attention, they're very poorly equipped. When you think about it, they have a lot of cool systems, but a good example to give is Winston Churchill himself, who was First Lord of the Admiralty at the beginning of World War One. He doesn't understand enough about the naval strategy, despite him being given details by Fisher and Corbett and all these people, that he ends up completely acquiescing to the Army strategic plan for World War One and not in any way making the case for naval one in the ministerial meetings. And then come to World War Two, he doesn't recognize that the Navy's already preparing for, they've already ordered the Flower class corvettes and the Hunt class escort destroyers and all these things and have got the escort production on the run. He doesn't recognize that. He goes, no, you have to stop capital ship and carrier construction, even cruiser construction, to get this, push this through. And they're going, well, then, as you and I would know, there's the fact that the shipyards themselves have all their own internal traditions. And if you're trying to move people, which at some points they were, from these major shipyards which deal with building big ships, to go and supplement people in smaller shipyards where they're building the Flower class and the Hunt class, it doesn't go well. It takes ages. It causes disruption. Actually causes more problems. And you sit there and go, once again, you could maybe with Churchill, they're allowed to be excused for not managing to make him understand these things because he was famously quite stubborn. But the thing is, it is also twice the Navy's failed to manage upwards. The person who's put in charge of them to explain to him, this is why we're doing this, and this is why you need to leave this alone, and this is why this matters. And the other famous thing, of course, is he actually backs up the Royal Air Force in stopping the Royal Navy getting a fighter, a single-seat fighter, because, they need Spitfires, and the Royal Navy can survive without it, because it doesn't matter. And you sit there and go, kind of would have mattered. It would have probably been divided some of Supermarine's effort, but it's always a fun thing to me when I point out, people go, Supermarine only produced the Spitfire for most of World War II, and I go, no, they're producing the Walrus as well. But the thing is, the RAF, no one ever complained about them producing the Walrus. They complain about them producing another fighter at the same time as the Spitfire. And you sit there and go, but it's a failure to communicate and manage upwards as well as manage outwards.
Yeah. So essentially, what is our culture? What are we about? How do we do things? What is our nature? What is our kind of core values? Mm-hmm. These are the things which are essentially lost when it comes to the Royal Navy in that sort of aftermath of the First World War period. And it takes the Navy a long time to begin to sort of, understand there is a problem here, and we need to we need to do something about this, which I think is really quite fascinating. But I suppose we should also move on to the idea of, what about naval culture at the lower deck? How should we actually begin to think about that? What is there on board ship in terms of things like customs and traditions, which foster an identity, which foster a sense of camaraderie, that idea of it takes 30 years to build a crew. What are you building that crew around? Not just professional competencies, but actually other forms. And I think that's kind of interesting. Things like ship names, what you call a ship, nicknames, things like ship's crest, the language which sailors use. Obviously we think of Jack speak in this country, but I'm sure there are other versions elsewhere. And other things like, naval crafts and skills. I mean, splicing ropes. It's not just a kind of strictly professional thing about how you actually splice a rope, but actually it's a thing of beauty at the same time in the way that is used. Things like ship traditions, naval etiquette, piping people on board, songs about the sea and things like that. And things like traditions at sea, things like crossing the line ceremonies. All these things are intrinsic to the idea of actually building an environment which recognizes itself as separate and unique, and creates this sense of identity, which really fosters this idea of the culture of a crew or a ship or a port, etc.
It's one of those things of when we talk about people, the one I like to bring up is top man. When people call someone a top man, they sort of they think, oh, it's a really good compliment. Someone go, do you know where that comes from? That comes from the guys who used to have to go up to the top of sails, the top men, because that's why they're called the top men. And they had to be the very best, because otherwise they go flying off the ship, because that was the most dangerous position up the top of the mast to do make sure the mast actually to top, they're unfurled or furled the canvas as they need to be in terms of sails. But also the other fun is, of course, the amount of times I'm told culture means no women aboard ship. And then you turn around and go, you do realize there were babies being born while the Battle of Trafalgar was raging around them? So there were women aboard the ships. We just tend to forget them. Or rather, they weren't part of the known crew. And it's the other fun thing is sort of in that period, and that's always fun to me, is just exactly how many women formed the Admiral's staff. Because, as you know, you will know, the admirals tend to send written out the documents. How do you get documents out quickly? Well, they technically have one writer. That's not going to get documents out quickly. But you then find examples of, well, the captain's wife who was aboard, or the admiral's daughters who were there, and these sort of people, they just helped out with the writing. And very quickly you realise that there was this informal staff of usually women, because they could usually write neater and faster, who were basically, the orders would be, the admiral would write out one version, and then it'd be stuck in front of them, and then they'd quickly copy it.
And later on, you're going to end up with enormous staffs of wrens. I'm currently sat in the old Mount Wise Naval Base. Close to me, less than 300 yards away, was a bunker which, during the Second World War, used something like 200 wrens at a time in actually sending out the signals to coordinate the Western Task Force when it comes to D-Day landings. There were entire fleets of wrens, and they were completely essential to getting those ideas out. So this idea of the kind of, how change maybe is incorporated within culture, how we forget certain things and then have to relearn those lessons, I think that's an interesting one.
It's like when I did actually a presentation a few years ago, which was for a fun one for some kids, but it was for A-level sort of age kids, and I was just gone into for a friend to help out a friend because they were trying to link science fiction to history and talk about that because it was a science fiction club. And I point out that I did a whole presentation which was about why Uhura in Star Trek was doing the traditional role, which women have been doing for centuries now, or being the ones who are actually managing the communications, because they were actually good at it, whereas most of the men involved were famously quite bad. And it's one of those things of, it was talking it through and showing it, and they're going, but we thought it was, no, it's not. It's just that usually the men have been quite bad, so usually, on average, the women involved have been better at this, so they've ended up in that role. But they could go up, especially, well, Uhura is a good example because she does go on to quite senior posts, but usually, if you are a good communicator in the Navy, you can go on to quite senior roles quite easily, because good communicators in navies are rare. People are usually very much doers rather than communicators, but you need to be a communicator in order to do the job well, in order to be able to tell other people what you're doing, It's
so some things remain the same, even though we might not actually, even though the kind of prior version of this might actually get lost. Some traditional roles remain the same. Some traditional customs, some traditional aspects of that naval culture remain the same, which is quite interesting that, you do have a horror which is being projected into the future in a very, very traditional role.
Oh, yeah. It's
I suppose also, one of the other issues here is how you manage that sense of kind of cultural shift. So, for example, the Royal Navy lost its onboard ship mascots. if I remember correctly, in the 1970s, when it was suddenly realised that maybe having all these animals on board, going from port to port, isn't necessarily the best idea. The doing away with grog as a daily ration. I mean, these things stand out in terms of things which are remembered, things which are celebrated, which are no longer with us, even though we're obviously decades on from the point at which those kind of aspects of maritime culture, naval culture, are actually lost, which I think is probably a testimony to just how significant they are.
Have you seen some of the pictures of the final day of the grog when there was all sort of ceremonies, funerals and all these things? I was told this recently by an American who'd be looking at it. Officially, he told me, he said they poured all the grog into the sea after that. And I went, who told you this? Well, that's what they were supposed to do. I went, yeah, this is the Royal Navy. If they managed to make them pour alcohol away, that's a feat greater than anything I've seen.
Well, it's interesting you hear that from an American, and obviously the idea of a dry navy under Josephus Daniels. I suspect this is a kind of carry on from an American naval tradition in terms of dry ships, interpreting what the Royal Navy would do at the point at which grog disappears over the side or maybe somewhere else.
Well, the Royal Navy ships still famously aren't dry, which is why the US Marines prefer serving on the Queen Elizabeth class carriers than they do the American carriers.
I'm sure it's a lot more fun. And also, the way in which certain things which may seem archaic actually continue onwards. So, things like crossing the line ceremonies. These are still important. It's still important moments in the naval life of sailors as a kind of way in which that past is sort of celebrated, even though on one level it's kind of completely ridiculous. But these traditions kind of matter.
They have got rid of the traditional tattooing part of it because, of course, traditionally naval sailors carried their entire CV on their body. All the tattoos meant something. And if you'd falsely acquired a tattoo, you could get into real trouble. Your colleagues would find you out, and you'd be in. That was one of the things that could make you a Jonah. But it was a case of that was your CV, and almost your CV was take off my shirt. Look, these are all the things I've achieved. Therefore, this is what I deserve to be paid.
Yeah. So I mean, even that naval tradition of tattooing, I think is a very fascinating one. And obviously that also that also extended into the civilian sphere as well. So it just shows how rich this particular field is. But I suppose we should move on to actually think about, well, is naval culture then a useful thing? Is it a useful concept? And effectively, is there a problem? I mean, have you got any thoughts on this?
I've been thinking about it ever since you proposed the topic, and I would say most of the problems I would argue with naval culture, because I would say some things have been rubbed out as they are no longer sort of really needed. Some of the parts of flogging and the extreme punishments, and as I said, the tattooing, whether you like it or not, all these things. But I would say also there are problems with it from the point of view of submarine service. I always call the silent service, and they are traditionally very silent. They need to speak, though. This is the problem. We are in a modern world where people base their opinions off what they saw on social media, and you can cry that all you want, but you aren't going to change it. And so, therefore, who puts the cool video on social media is going to matter. There's a reason why in the last few years, the only service which hasn't struggled for recruitment, which has been regularly oversubscribed, is the Royal Marines. Who does without a doubt, the coolest ads every single year that get replayed all over social media? It's the Royal Marines. It has been every year. It's the Royal Marines. It's a state of mind. All these sort of things come out. And you sit there and go, yeah, I'm not surprised they haven't struggled for recruitment. But also, strange enough, they don't struggle for that. But then they really struggle in making the case for themselves against the army, and they get cut almost continually and have always been under threat. And you could argue Albion and Bulwarks recent decision, they're even more under threat than they were previously. And that's the really weird juxtaposition, because you have this service which is really great at communicating why people should join it, but it's not so good at articulating why it shouldn't be reduced in number.
Yeah.
And other services which are better at articulating that, but not so good at getting people to join them up.
Yeah. So I think we are sort of saying it's useful, and there is also a kind of problem here. One of the things that I sort of noticed when I was sort of do some investigation into this is the way in which that kind of naval culture, both the British and the United States Navy, the Royal Navy and the United States Navy, have attempted to express key aspects of their naval culture in terms of what might be described as core values. And both have statements on what those core values are. So, for example, with the Royal Navy, we have a thing called CC drill or C2 drill, the idea of commitment, courage, discipline, respect for others, integrity, and loyalty as a kind of key expression of the kind of traditions, the naval culture, which you expect to find in the United States. And likewise, in the United States Navy, you know, we've got honor, courage, and commitment as sort of vital expressions of what that naval culture is. And yet it was interesting when I sort of looked at the idea of honor, courage, and commitment. That was adopted in 1992, following the 1991 tailhook scandal, taking the United States Marine Corps' core values, replacing the Navy ones, which have been professionalism, integrity, and tradition. So, as it were, navies are adapting their core values and, in a sense, expressing their naval culture in different ways at various times, and potentially updating things as a means to actually update their naval culture and express it in the most clear way possible. And I think the United States is maybe a little bit further ahead, shall we say, than the Royal Navy. I'm sort of waving a white ensign here, but I also feel that the United States Navy is perhaps a little bit further ahead.
I think in some ways they've had to be, because they're having to justify a far larger force, aren't they? So they've had to push it through. They've had to try and adapt to making the case for themselves. And I've met some of their media officers, and they are... The Navy spends a lot of time making sure that they are fully engaged, fully knowledgeable, but also accepting that they're going to have to do things which are going to be a bit weird, which is why I really liked when RO6 Cat was wandering around. I think it was RO6 or was it RO9
yes.
Cat?
Yeah.
That was really good. The fact it's now pretty much disappeared annoys me.
Yeah.
Because that was quite a clever, quite a clever idea, don't it?
Yeah. And some of the individual tweetos are on board ship were absolute masters and mistresses, one imagines, but obviously we don't know who they were, of that craft of actually getting the ideas out there and expressing that kind of naval culture and those core values in a fun and accessible way. And it almost feels like gone a bit quiet subsequently.
Yeah, there is one part of tradition, though, which I think is kind of, well, I think my strong suspicion from what I've heard is that, as usual, they got a bit flew a bit too close to the sun, and certain, how to put us, certain central offices of press communication were worried that they might be outplaying them. And that's always a problem. There's always going to be jealousies in politics. But one of the things I do find interesting is, of course, you talked about the scandal affecting the US Navy, the tailhook scandal, and there's been other scandals. The trouble is, navies have traditionally had to have, I don't want to say a level of criminality, but a level of acquisitional natures throughout their history to survive. If you consider the Royal Navy's always famed for, well, if it's not absolutely bolted down and made of stone, then they might well pilfer it if they think they can use it. And during World War II, there's famously the fact that the army stores the Italian army's captured AA guns in a park not far from Navy base, leaves them there, thinks they're going to be fine, and comes back because they have an idea of what to do with them, and they find them all gone because the Navy have gone and mounted them on their ships and have gone, they're not being used. They've got ammunition and everything. Oh, we'll take those. And the Australian Navy and the Royal Navy have quite happily nicked them. And haven't bothered to do any of the forms. Now, that's, of course, applauded in wartime. But the trouble is, if you've got that as part of your traditional culture, there can be a bad side to that if it becomes personally motivated. There's a thing of that's being, to an extent, problematic on the side of your ship, your country, which can sort of, to an extent, be justified. It's when it becomes personally motivated that's a problem. And balancing that and watching for that is an issue for navies. I think the Royal Navy's managed to avoid that quite so much, but even they've had, I think they've stamped down almost too hard, because there was a Royal Navy captain who was got rid of because he'd driven quite a long way in the wrong car, and he put the fuel budget in, and he went, oh, sorry, I've mucked up. Instead of go, you've got rid of a captain who's had 20, 30 years of experience over using the wrong car. Okay, yes, he shouldn't have done it, but you're then saying we've got to do this because we're preserving naval standards. That's kind of an expensive loss for that criteria when he was one of the captains who we were all expecting, as he'd been a captain, I think it was Prince of Wales, of a carrier. We were all expecting him to go on to more senior ranks. Because again, the captain's a guy who's put in charge, or a guy or girl who's been in charge of a carrier, the captain, it's not going to be someone who you'd expect to be hanging around as just the captain for the rest of their career. You'd expect them to be going on to more senior. But yeah, it's a case of you've got to balance these things. You've got to balance that tradition of we will get what we need to do the job with
yeah.
And
it's interesting, that idea of, the shall we say, navies as pilferers, if we can call it that, a certain level of criminality. That is also shared, as it were, within the kind of wider maritime field. I mean, I can remember my father telling me, he was a merchant seaman during the Second World War. He said, they would always have a ship's cat as a kind of mascot and a kind of rat catcher. Whenever they went into port, the cat would decamp and promptly disappear. But because the ship's papers said there was a cat on board, come departure point, they would be hunting around the docks trying to find any cat to Shanghai and take it on board so that they could produce it and say, here is the cat specified in the ship's papers. And likewise, there would always be a prohibition on using the ship's heads while in port, particularly in dock basins. So typically what they'd do is they go on board the, shall we say, rival shipping companies, which tended to have their own sort of special toilet paper with an identity, and they would liberate certain stocks of toilet paper and take it back to their ship and use it in the dock basin. And of course, the paper would say it belonged to such and such a shipping company. So they would be. So I think this is kind of a maritime culture, which is the Royal Navy is actually sort of fully part and parcel of. These things are quite cyclical, especially because you do have this interchange between the merchant navy and national navies.
Well, that was also the other interesting thing, because I was doing this recently. I did a video about the Bathurst class corvettes, and where, of course, all their officers came from. Because, of course, this is really kind of interesting. This is the Australians producing their own sort of rough equivalent of the Flower class. And it comes through the sloops developed in the interwar period. There's sort of this concept of what we need as an escort is developed through the sloop program and through that development, which is, put through. And then they have a sort of idea of what they need, and then everyone's hunting around for a suitable merchant vessel to build around it. And basically the Australians go, well, we don't need to, because we only really produce Admiralty level boilers here. So we can produce something slightly different. So we're going to build that. And we build they build 60 of them. And the Royal Navy even orders some for the Royal Indian Navy and for the Royal Australian Navy, but they're paid for by the British, but they're crewed by the Royal Australians. And then you've got the Flower class, which are adopted sort of all around the world. And the thing that interested me in that was the other Australians had such a facility of their own shipyards, etc. They could do this entirely themselves. They had their own industry. They could build these vessels themselves, barring getting the guns and some of the radars, which honestly they tended to build their own version of radars. But also, the thing is, these vessels, when they're being used, they're mostly being commanded by reservists who are RANVR brackets S, which meant they were merchant sailors because the Royal Navy and them both had R&R-S and RANVR-S. The Australians were mostly VR because quite a lot of their merchant sailors also quite like yachting. And so they joined the volunteer reserve, which was associated with Yacht Club. But also, those clubs tended to have fairly good, how do I put this, equipment and places for you to go if you came into port and you wanted to have a shower. So there was quite a good reason for a merchant sailor officer who wants to be, when he comes into port after being a master of a ship, etc., and he wants to have somewhere to go have a nice relaxation, have a drink, have a shower, maybe have a bit of a lie down. Joining the VR and being able to flash his badge and walk into that local equivalent of almost a yacht club scenario was very useful. And then in wartime, these guys turned out to be brilliant captains and officers of these Bathurst class corvettes, and they did some absolutely insane stuff. There was one who decided that, well, he couldn't quite zigzag and engage a submarine, so instead, what he did was he said he would make the ship shimmy. And you sort of go, what do you mean by shimmying? And he had managed to, using the minesweeper gear, rig it up so he could do far more violent turns. Because it turned out he'd worked in a merchant ship which had trouble. They'd had to rig up extra rudders. So he, using some of the minesweeper gear, rigged up so he could do violent turns. So he was actually doing that as he was going along through the water. It's nuts, but it worked.
Yeah. And it's another great example of the way in which that kind of national maritime culture, the civilian merchant navy culture can then intersect with strictly naval culture. So yeah, that's a really nice example, and the idea of actually learning from each other in very practical ways, as well as more, so we say, creative ways when it comes to shimmying. So that's kind of nice.
Well, you sort of sit there and look at it, go. Naval officers, people who've been up for naval background, would probably not think about it because they've had zigzagging so ingrained in them they wouldn't think that through. But this merchant sailor, he's a lieutenant commander, Royal Australian Naval Volunteer Reserve. He's also had 25 years merchant sailor experience. He sort of straddles the two, and he's going, yeah, these waters, the zigzag, I haven't got enough space to zigzag, so I need to do something else if I'm going to deal with this. Okay, I'll shimmy. And okay.
Yeah. Makes me wonder whether that bit in Battleship, where you get the Missouri to do the equivalent of a handbrake turn by dropping the anchor, maybe that's inspired by that particular story.
Could be. It was apparently there was a US destroyer was with them, and I was watching and just going, "What are you doing?"
Yeah.
The poor US destroyer was probably going, "The Australians really are nuts, aren't they? Really nuts. How do you do that?"
Yeah, it's a nice little turn. Little turn. I mean, one other thing that I think is worth touching on in terms of our discussion on naval culture. I don't know whether you saw, but in 2019, the US Navy released initial guidance for building a culture of excellence.
Mm-hmm.
Come across that by any chance?
Yes, I have. I hadn't read it in a while,
And
but I did come across it when it came out.
It didn't work entirely well. And in March 2024, the Navy has launched a Culture of Excellence 2.0, which is actually building upon a sort of lot of these ideas that we've actually touched upon in this program. And I would advise anybody to have a look at that. The United States Navy is making a lot of the kind of learning materials and the kind of playbook, if we can call it that, in terms of how you use the kind of culture within the United States Navy. It is well worth a look. There's a 40-page handbook, which I think is very, very advanced in terms of actually thinking about how you build the culture of a crew, the culture within a Navy, what you need to do to enshrine those core values. It's well worth a look, folks. And I think the United States Navy, God bless them, is streets ahead of most other navies in terms of this kind of idea of an institutional culture.
I think they also have to be in some regards. It's the size is a factor, but also it's the breadth of operations they're taking on. It's one of the things I often have fun with people who sit down and go, well, why aren't ships cheaper? This is an anti-submarine warfare frigate. And I go, it's not just an ASW warfare frigate, though. It's going to have an air defense missiles. It's going to have damage. It's going to have to be able to do damage control for itself and keep itself running, but also probably disaster relief. It's going to have to do a whole range of missions beyond ASW. ASW frigate is what it's sold as when you're trying to justify it to the Treasury, because you have to have something plain and simple to justify it. But the trouble is, that thing will justify its construction, but not justify its retention in service. It needs to be able to do other things as well. And you need to be able to show you can do the disaster relief, because there's been disaster. You need to show up and go, yeah, we're useful. We can do maritime security. We can do this with these vessels as well, because you need to justify keeping it. You can justify building it with the sticker on the tin. You can't justify its retention unless that tin is crammed with a whole lot of things beyond what the sticker says. And that's a lot of those things, though, if we consider about disaster relief, etc., they come down to culture, because it's a historical thing that navies have got involved in it and have been doing it. Yes, they've been there, but doing more than taking care of yourself and your own ship, that's culture as it starts out. Yes, it's now policy, but it was always culture. It was always something you did.
And we can call it the culture of the sea. I mean, the idea that, you go to the rescue of others, especially when they're in harm's way in the water, I think is a really fascinating one. And we can even see, I think, in such things as the way the German Navy largely behaved during the Second World War. The idea that U-boat crews would habitually, even after Dönitz has given his Laconia order of late 1942, would actually go out of their way to render assistance to what they saw as fellow mariners in the water following a sinking. I think it is testament to this idea of a kind of culture of the sea, which obviously naval culture would also sort of fit quite nicely within.
I was talking about one of those recently, because what they did was they signaled to head office, and despite the Laconia order, then the head office signaled to the Portuguese, and the Portuguese sent out a ship. And the reason they did this was because there was Italian prisoners of war aboard the British ship they just sunk.
Yeah.
And this was off the coast of Africa. Yeah. So, of course, the lovely joys of World War II, there are theatres which people actually believe are safe, and so they don't have escorts or convoys running through them because, well, they don't have convoys because they don't have any escorts, and their view is it's safer for ships to travel solo than travel in a convoy unescorted. Never quite sure about the reasoning behind that, because it's still only one pinprick in the ocean, and to the extent that merchant ships can offer each other some form of mutual protection, especially if if they've all got guns on them, individual guns. Then if a surface raider turns up, well, you're dealing with 12 ships which have one gun, so there's 12 guns versus you, and you have to engage 12 different targets. That means it gives them a bit of a chance. But I can also understand the idea of, well, also it could turn into a submarine massacre if you've got 12 in convoy and you've got no escorts with them. So I can understand. It's an argument I can see why they fought the way they did. I might not agree, but it's one of those things of, well, I'm also judging in the hindsight of history, so there's that on me. But that was, again, this culture of how we manage war, how we divide up war. And again, it was something which they had to almost relearn again, I think, because the Napoleonic Wars had always been global, and the Royal Navy had always treated them as global conflicts. Then you've got World War One, which starts off as global, but very quickly narrows down to pretty much focusing on certain areas of the world. It doesn't expand much beyond that once it's got through a certain period. And World War II goes global again. And almost that part of culture of the war will be global the moment navies are involved, had to an extent been forgotten due to the technology. Not because the navies had set out to forget it, or in any ways had reduced in size, realistically, but because the technology hadn't really supported, because if you got the transition from age of sail, where you could go everywhere because your sail could take over, to an age where it takes a while for engines to get to that level of efficiency that you can carry enough fuel to have that range to go to the Indian Ocean from Germany, to have that capability, that scope of maneuver. And it's quite always interests me how quickly they'd forgotten it, how quickly navies had forgotten that was the reality, because it was institutional memory, but it went away not because anyone was trying to forget it, but just because it hadn't been that way for a while.
Yeah, that's quite fascinating. Yeah, yeah. So we're also dealing with sort of, cultures of risk, cultures of loss, in terms of the way in which a navy actually operates in a wartime environment like the Second World War, and indeed beyond.
Which worries us for today, really, because we haven't had anything of that scale for such a long time. I'm sure people are wargaming it and doing all those things, and I realize that's a big part they now have of trying to maintain the culture, maintain the understanding. But there's always, to me, a difference between, how do I put this? There's having the knowledge up here and having the knowledge in here when you're doing it. And in many ways, culture is about having the knowledge in here. This is the theory. This is what I've been working on in terms of gaming and thinking out. But it's turning that into that. And that's what takes your generations. That's what takes 30 years to inoculate into 300 years.
Yeah. And sometimes that idea of a kind of culture, that idea of being able to reach back into the past in terms of institutional memory, is what can guide you through the kind of initial first clash when a shooting war does actually break out. That sense of, well, how was it done in the past? What's the traditional way of answering this particular problem and responding to this crisis? So yeah, I think that's a very useful way to actually sort of, think about the way in which maybe those kind of cultures enable us to think in terms of the future, and potentially the struggles which are yet to come.
Oh, yeah. I say one of the things is I have sort of written on the cultural subject because in Trials, Battles, and Darings, when I did my book, one of the things that really impressed me was how quickly the Royal Navy produced a culture for the tribal class that they expected themselves to be at the front. They expected themselves. Part of the reason why they acted the way they did was they expected, because they were tribal class destroyer crews, they had to be the best. And they expected that of themselves. And they expected themselves to be at the front. And one of the reasons why they do all the things they do at Narvik, HMS Eskimo is a classic example. She loses her bow. Most ships in that scenario are going to withdraw or halt. She doesn't. She carries on because she knows she's got to be at the front, because there are other destroyers coming around behind her, and it's her job as a tribal class destroyer to clear their path. And she just carries on reversing at the enemy and just continues her turn, fires her torpedoes, and advances sternwards towards them, and then angles so that B mount can carry on firing, despite A mount and all the forward having been blown off. And that's entirely culture, but that's actually, that looked like, when you're sort of reading these ships, that's quite a new culture. But no, it's sort of the Royal Navy's taken the existing destroyer culture, which has come out of the Harwich Force, not largely speaking, World War One, largely come from them, and that's the culture they've promulgated through the Navy. For the destroyers of viewing themselves as elite, and are then kind of bootstrap that by going, and you are going to be the elite of the elite, and you have to hold yourself to these standards. And sometimes people look to me and go, so did the Royal Navy go through the Navy being very selective, selecting the very best of the best? I went, no, they selected quite good officers. They got quite good officers, and the sailors. But mostly, those officers and sailors, when they joined the tribal crews, they expected this of themselves, and so that's how they performed.
Yeah,
and of course.
And where would that come from? We're back to Mount Evans of HMS Broke, isn't it? Yeah. And maybe also he's channeling before that Nelsonian culture, the culture of the Nelsonian Navy. Getting close, engage the enemy more closely, go at them as hard as you can. So that's just taken in 150 years worth of British naval culture in terms of actually defining the way in which those tribal class destroyer crews envisaged themselves and their role, and lived up to it.
Yeah, they really did. They were absolutely. There's a reason why I think the only surviving tribal class destroyer in the world is HMCS Haida sitting in Canada. The fact, though, that we did get rid of the 4 that survived for the Royal Navy after World War II is something I do hold against the government of the time and many other governments since, but leave that to one side. It's like the last surviving Flag class corvette is sitting over in Canada. And she's wonderful to go and see. But then you go to Australia, which of course produced these 60 Bathurst class corvettes. Guess how many of them are still around?
No idea.
2 out of 60.
Many as that. Wow.
Yeah. One's still sitting in the water, HMAS Castlemaine, and HMS Whalia, which I keep pronouncing wrong apparently. There's supposed to be more emphasis on the A. I do apologize, but I'm British, not Australian. There is a limit to my ability to paraphrase words which are theoretically English language but are actually Australian. And she sits at Whalia. The really fun thing is the company which built her basically then sponsored the government to bring her back, put her ashore, and have her as a walk-through museum and these things because she was mattered to them. And they're a massive mining company to this day. And they don't build ships anymore. But the thing is, that was their association. Was they built these ships as part of defending their mining trade. And then after the war was over, they wanted to make sure they had a memory of it as a company, as an organization, what they'd done.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Institutional culture, institutional memory.
But yeah. But it's appropriate again for the Canadians that the ships they've kept are the Tribal class and the Flag class because they were the Battle Atlantic. That was their battle, and their tribals were, well, HMCS Haida, the fightingest ship in the Navy. Have you ever been to see her?
No.
She's in Hamilton, Ontario. You can actually see where her captain has occasionally stuck a knife into the ship when he's been frustrated with things.
Unusual?
Yeah, he was very, very aggressive as a destroyer commander. They, of course, did famously charge for a minefield at one point, just because the enemy was the other side. But leaving that to one side, you can actually still feel the marks on the wood where he's dug that knife. And what I love is there's a Royal Canadian Naval Reserve base right next to where she is in Hamilton, Ontario. And they come and take them around the ship on a regular basis. And the way the reserve runs in the Canadians is that quite a lot of regulars pop down into reserve or pop up, and they alternate around a bit more. They have far more intermix than necessarily we do because of the way they run their service. And so quite a lot of their Canadian officers, the Canadians, who we often think, their national reputation being these really nice people, and yet they're being shown up. One of the higher senior officers they're being told to look up to, trying to look up, is the guy who literally was so frustrated sometimes with, or so delighted sometimes that he's attacking the enemy, that he stuck his knife into a piece of wood on the ship's bridge. And that as a culture, that image doesn't really fit with our image of Canadian culture, does it?
No, it doesn't. Although, maybe it goes back to an older day when, captains might lead boarding parties. Maybe he was just being prepared for the moment when Haida would go alongside some enemy vessel and they would be forced to storm aboard.
Well, Canadians do, of course, have that thing of they were the ones who managed to board a submarine naked. That was 3 of them took a submarine, and you can just imagine the poor German crews pointing a gun up the hatch as this is coming down towards them, going, "What do we do? They're naked. Yeah. They're attacking us. They're boarding us naked. Who does that?"
Somewhat disconcerting, I would imagine. Yeah.
Yes. Oh, but no.
Cool.
So what do you see as the challenges of culture now? What are the challenges you think that you're facing? I know the US Navy have this framework which has come out, and I'll go look that up because I hadn't realized there was a newer one. But what do you see as the challenges of culture now for navies? So, especially when you've got all these things of social media and all the other issues which are instantaneous going on, how are they going to approach it? How do they deal with it?
I think in a way, I think in a way you're sort of pointing towards it. I mean, I think we're dealing with now, in general terms, with a culture which is far more instantaneous, far more riven by division along generational lines. So the ability to actually sort of create bridges between people with very different experiences and maybe living in very different circumstances from each other, I think is a challenge which certainly the United States Navy is actually grappling with. You know, there's actually one sort of quite nice graph within that document released in March 2024, which is talking about the way in which, you know, what proportion of the Navy is now made up with baby boomers and what proportion of it is Generation X, what proportion of it is millennial. And, you know, it's kind of interesting that, you know, we could rely on maybe 40 years ago that we could have these common reference points in national culture, which echo perhaps certain things within naval culture. You know, things like, well, we've all seen In Which We Served. We've all seen The Cruel Sea. We could rely on the fact that people have done that. But of course, now with the rise of Netflix, subscription channels, social media, YouTube, etc., we can't necessarily rely on that in the same way that we once did, as a point of breeding sort of, or creating sort of common points where we can actually use kind of commonalities of culture to actually explain, well, this is how it's done. You know, you look at In Which We Serve, you know, the commanding officer, I think, has got a very interesting approach towards ship management and a sense of how you deal with ordinary, with the lower deck and with those around you, and, you know, how you build a kind of culture on board ship. That served as a kind of role model. Well, those points of common culture, I think, are essentially gone. And it's a way now, potentially, that we have to find to inscribe a kind of common naval culture, not in terms of making reference to things which are there within a national culture, but in terms of documents produced within navies to enshrine the way things are done, to explain in detail, this is how it's done, this is why it's done, and this is why it's always been done in this way. So I think that's the challenge.
To be fair, the Royal Navy and a couple of other navies have a tradition of not writing things down. You know, that's what really caused the Royal Navy trouble in the run up to World War One, because the Army had a general staff and they were producing documents, etc., about what they were doing, their strategy for how to fight a war, and their strategy in certain parts was just a timetable, just a ferry timetable. Please admit that there is other more documents to it. There are certain parts of the strategy which are literally just a ferry timetable, and yet the Navy weren't, because the Navy staff weren't oriented around. You look at where does the Navy have? People go, well, Navy didn't have a staff. They did have a staff, but they're all grouped around the constructor, the third Sea Lord. The naval staff are all grouped around supplying ships at sea and building ships. That's what using ships, operating ships. They don't have a staff really for, because today they've still got this idea, this mindset of it's admirals going alone. And actually, that's a false image as well, because as we talked about at the beginning of this, when we talked about Wrens, the fact is that the admirals in the Napoleonic era, they did have a staff. It's just the staff was an informal staff. It was, they didn't just have a flag lieutenant and a single writer and all these sort of. They also had the women aboard the ship, and they would utilize them, especially the ones who could write in. You know, it's how do admirals sometimes write letters to countries in languages they don't speak? Well, the answer would be, have a look down the women aboard the ship. You'll probably find one of them who's a bit of a linguist, and probably she actually wrote the letter.
And yet, in a sense, while there is so much which is unwritten, the Royal Navy in particular was extremely good at writing other things down. So you've got this whole series of books, the BR series of books, in which they would describe to the nth degree how certain very technical processes were set down, how seamanship was to be approached, how how stokers were to manage their particular job. But the more ethereal level of sort of the culture of navies, that was never actually set down in the way in which perhaps it could have been and perhaps should have been.
And it's also the Royal Navy, which does, I'm not sure if you've read them, but some of these incredibly beautiful studies into tribes around the empire for the tribal class naming.
Yeah.
So they did massively detailed studies into the history of the tribes. And some of these tribes, they never have had a tradition of writing down. It's always been oral. And so the earliest writing down of their traditions is actually done by the Royal Navy, who are seeking this detail to justify whether this tribe will be given a vessel name for them or won't be. Yeah. And whether the tribe is sufficiently martial and honourable to be for a ship's crew to be built around that name. And you sit there and go, hey, that's an incredibly early 20th century view of these things, but they did these massive documents and these histories. And that was one of the things I had fun when I did my book again. Sorry to keep referring to it, but it was a case of some people contact me going, why are you talking about this? How do you know this about our history? I go, well, it was all written down. It's written down? Yeah. There's a whole document in the archives on it. And they were quite shocked because they'd done searches, but they hadn't thought the Royal Navy would be the one writing the history of the tribe. They thought it would be colonial office or something like that. They'd searched them and they had nothing.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's the weird thing. But then conversely, ask the Royal Navy to have written the same period. Have you got your battle plans for War of Germany? Up here.
Yeah. Safest place. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not written down.
Oh, good lord. And then the trouble is then they have admirals who are so used to talking inwards to Navy. They're not, the classic thing is there was an admiral at the cabinet meeting which is deciding strategy, and he doesn't speak up because he doesn't feel confident enough in arguing against them all in this type of scenario. And you sort of go, that's when a political admiral like Beatty is actually kind of useful because they have enough political ego. They will argue about it. I might not always think the man is the best organizer of a staff, etc., because he does tend to select for their connections rather than their ability to do the job. I always remember that he turns down Somerville for the gentleman who ends up getting all the blame. But Somerville was a career communications officer. Seymour wasn't. So if he'd had Somerville instead of Seymour, our memory of Beatty might be completely different because his signals would have actually probably made sense. But instead, he takes an officer who hasn't been trained in the role, puts him in the role because of his connections, and then puts the blame on him, which is where I sort of start to dislike him.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. Anyway, I think that's been an hour, and I'm not sure how much more we can. Anything we haven't talked about because I think we've covered it all.
No, I think we've given a reasonable introduction, a kick around to the bag of water, which is naval culture, and hopefully people have enjoyed it, and people will go away with one or two thoughts, and maybe check out that document of March 2024.
And I do this with any books you want to recommend, any books of your own that are coming out that you want to talk about or recommend, you would like people to go and have a look at. Because I've got a fair number of your books. And I always enjoyed them. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. You can be my top reviewer. Absolutely.
I have no idea where any of them are at this moment because I have literally just unpacked the books into bookshelves. But I do have because I remember you one which I think was it was the Dispatches one. It was the one full of all the things around not D-Day, Dunkirk. And all the dispatches, I think it was.
Yeah, I mean various admirals' dispatches in the Second World War.
Yeah, and that was really cool to go through, and also a really good resource to have because I went, I got this here. Okay, I will still go to the archives to check up these materials, but if I haven't I can make a rough idea based off this information before I go to the archives. And this is the thing: books like that are so useful if you're trying to do research. If you're and Glyn Stewart, to use an example, I know he's read it. And he used it as reading because I'd recommend him to him because he wanted a good thing to show what communication style would like to be to the Navy. So I'd recommended that book to him. Well, if you read that, that's got the comms in it. And he's used it and he's gone, yeah, so this is how you send out these messages. This is how they would communicate. And that was a really interesting thing to me for culture as well, because there's the things of how they're formatting those messages. A lot of that is down to their culture. There's stuff in there which is you are expected to understand this. Yes. I'm not going to explain this. I'm going to save space. I don't need to explain this. And that's why I can reference this point.
Yes. And on a similar vein, I mean, one of the things that I'm involved with is the Britannia Naval Histories of World War II, which are publishing most of the Royal Navy Naval Staff's battle summaries, which appear during and after the Second World War. The latest ones back into that's quite a good example.
I have lots of them. I use them a lot on my I use them a lot on my show. I'm always pushing them because they are really great. Again, kind of like the dispatches, it's a really great resource to have as your archive. You know, if you can't get to the National Archives but you're interested in reading resources, pretty much got the documents in there.
Well, the problem is most of them, because they were confidential, were actually pulled. They had a kind of use by date, but because I'm involved with Britannia Royal Naval College, and the college library has got one of the only full sets in the country, our idea was to bring those to national and indeed international attention as a kind of first cast of history. This is the naval staff trying to understand an event or a set of events which elements of the Royal Navy have recently gone through, to inscribe it in the institutional memory, and for it also to serve as a kind of first cast of history. So these are this ongoing publishing program. We recently brought out ones for D-Day, and we also brought out the one dealing with the convoys to Russia, and the program is ongoing. We've got a new one out on Norway in the not too far distant future, and we'll be turning ourselves back towards Japan in probably the next edition. They give a really interesting first gloss of history and a really first idea of the way in which the Royal Navy is trying to inscribe lessons learned within its own institutional culture in terms of campaigns or battles recently fought. So I've continued to be involved with that, and looking forward to working on the next one.
I have to say, with the Japan one, I have to make sure I have a copy of it because we are hoping to head to Japan next year. Probably, we've been told basically by the museums, don't come in June, July, which is the normal ship shape. The group I go these big international trips with, usually do June, July. They've told us, you'll be baked. Don't come. Don't save yourselves. And so we sort of moved it back in the year. It's probably going to be September, October time. And yeah, I'm looking forward to that. We're going to have a month in Japan going around the museums and videoing them and recording them, and sort of going to put up videos about what we see out there. And that'll be a great book to take with me on that trip, to have with me out there, to compare with their accounts they have, what Navy's first draft of the account situations was. It'd be interesting.
Excellent.
Because that is also there's sometimes a fun thing. I remember once when I was talking through one, there was someone who was very insistent in the comments I should correct it because there was their analysis, and then we found out later on with archaeology, etc. No, the enemy weren't quite where we thought they were. And I said, no, you don't correct it. This is the history as they thought it was at the time, and that's their interpretation. It's useful. The fact that we know, and I mentioned in the video, we actually found out later, about 20 years after it's written, that was actually not quite the case, is also useful.
Yes.
Because you have to remember that 20 years of decisions are based on the idea being that way. And then afterwards they go, no, it was that. And well, how does this change things?
Yeah. You need the kind of forks in the road about where we thought one thing, but in fact the opposite or something slightly different was in fact true, because those are the real turning points in history, where if things had been slightly different, if they really had have known where X was, then it would have made all the difference. So yeah,
Yeah.
the false leads are also important.
Yeah, that's good. Anyway, thank you for doing this, Harry.
That's all right. My absolute pleasure, and I hope your viewers have enjoyed this, and we'll be posting some fine tributes to you in the comments section, and hopefully not too much abuse along the way.
I don't mind. It to me, it's usually a lot of fun chats in the comment section, especially as I do a com response video series now. So people tend to go, okay, if I go too far, then he'll put my video up on screen and will talk back to me. I've noticed since I've been doing that com response series, that some of the comments have changed quite dramatically.
Really.
There are literal comments now when I've written, because it's called Scuttlebutt series. So when I write Scuttlebutt, because that's what I've got, it seemed appropriate. Scuttlebutt, Scuttlebutt. You know, when I write Scuttlebutt 9 or whatever underneath the comment, so I remember to go back to it, get it for the video. There's usually just kind of comment off going, "Oh no, what have I done now?"
You're on the naughty step.
I know, it's usually because they're very good comments. I usually pick out the good ones to respond to and have a chat with.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you very much, and thank you for doing this.
My pleasure.
Wow, I hope you enjoyed that. I certainly did. It was what I was really looking forward to. And there's more of these coming up. There are more. There's hopefully going to be hopefully, if the recording schedule has gone to plan, it'll be San Marciagos as Macaronis coming next, and that's going to be really, really cool. Thank you for everyone who supports the channel, who likes, shares, and subscribes, and helps me keep this channel going, me keep doing the research which underpins all this channel and all the work I do. Thank you for that. And just thank you for those who watch it on Twitch and on YouTube, and those who interact to support it. You make this all possible. And yeah, please do remember that there will be a live on Boxing Day evening. That will be on both Twitch and YouTube, and it's going to be one of the patron suggested topics. And yeah, I think that'll be fun, and that's a nice way to if on Boxing Day you're going, you know what, I just want to go off and hide and watch some naval history and chat away with my naval history buddies and just the family party just a little bit by that point, because you know we all enjoy it. It's always fun. The family parties, I always love them, but they start, I don't know about for you, but for me they start on about the 23rd, and they will go on pretty much till the 2nd of January. And so I do like a couple of to be able to sort of take some time out occasionally on the odd afternoon and just or evening and disappear off and just get a little bit of time to myself after being surrounded by all the family. But it's a lot of fun, and yeah, it's something I look forward to every Christmas. But I'm hoping that the live on Boxing Day will be a chance for everyone who needs to do that little detox to just disappear off and have some fun, hopefully. Thank you very much for watching. Take care, and thank you for supporting the channel.